I'm Greg Castillo. I'm a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. I teach at the College of Environmental Design, and I can't resist giving a little shout out to my students who are on their first day of the semester. Go Bears. So what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about my engagement in counterculture building, which began 5 years ago. And to do that, I'm going to start my slideshow. And so are we getting a screen share on that?
Yeah, that's good.
Perfect. Okay. So about 5 years ago, I began preparing for an exhibition at the Berkeley Art Museum. I was a guest curator of Hippie Modernism, and that was a show that was originally created at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. It opened in 2017, and I was responsible for adding local material from the Bay Area to this exhibition that we shipped in. So we added a lot of new material. My learning curve was incredibly steep. I had very few scholarly works to guide me because relatively few exist about counterculture visual design. So in this talk, I'm going to present a viewpoint that's derived from this exhibition research. And if you'd like to read more about the building legacy of this era, you can check out an essay that I wrote called Hippie Modernism, which is on the online journal Places. So if you just look up Places Journal and my last name, you'll come up with that. So first, I should take a stab at answering a question that I actually heard a lot a few years ago at the Art Museum, which is, what the heck is hippie modernism? So it's a term that takes two contradictory notions and smashes them together. And I think for Andrew Blauvelt, who's a curator at the Walker Art Center, who put this first version of the exhibition together, it was intended as a provocation. He was hoping to help move our understanding beyond counterculture stereotypes of flower power slackers and to recognize that hippie modernism consisted of counterculture creatives, in other words, a counterculture maker culture, and their fellow travelers. So architectural history has its own hippie stereotype. That's the stereotype that focuses on Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome as the signature counterculture building type. And to a certain extent, hippies themselves were responsible for this stereotype. During the 1960s, Buckminster Fuller traversed the entire US, giving lectures that promoted a visionary worldview. And he framed design in terms of engineering, philosophy, and human psychology. A lecture that Fuller gave in 1965 at the University of Colorado provided the inspiration for Drop City, which you see at the top and on the right. Captivated by Buckminster Fuller's talk, Clark Reichert, an artist, and his fellow droppers, that's the group group name they went by, they together cobbled a geodesic shantytown from scavenged materials, including lumber scraps, factory reject plywood, tar paper, chicken wire, and believe it or not, junkyard car roots. That's what the dome on the right is built out of. Their live-in sculpture park survived for about a decade before reverting back to the detritus from which it was made. So if you visit the site now, it's actually vacant. So in celebrating this hippie infatuation with geodesics, we've missed Fuller's more enduring counterculture contribution, which were his spatial beliefs about innovation in what he called the outlaw area. Fuller's notion of the outlaw area emerged from a very idiosyncratic understanding of technology, and essentially he invented his own origin myth for technology. Fuller claimed that early civilizations produced breakthroughs only by taking to the open sea. Fuller saw the ocean as an outlaw area that imposed challenges in a zone unregulated by land-based covenants and culture. Sailors, according to Fuller, became world men. Lawlessness begat weaponry, but ultimately advanced the technology of what Fuller called livingry. So Fuller awarded Drop City his 1967 Dymaxion Award for its mad riffs on livingry, in other words, reinventing his geodesic geometry. This Drop City legacy can be seen at the Henry Ford Museum, which in 1999 installed a display entitled Communal Living in a Geodesic Dome, 1973. You see it at the bottom of the screen. A cage of metal dome struts frames a cast iron stove, thrift store furniture, and the, of course, obligatory fern in its macrame hanger. This display advanced Henry Ford's goal in founding a museum to, quote, reproduce American life as lived as the best way of preserving our history and tradition. But if we look closely at the slide, we'll see that a crucial detail actually betrays Ford's mission statement. And here it is. These metal dome struts are milled and joined with a jeweler's precision. It violates the entire culture of scavenging that you see on the right that was embraced by both hippies and their dropper avant-garde. In an essay entitled Funk Architecture, one of the drop city builders argued that building from scrap was more important than the dome it produced. He insisted in his manifesto that, quote, we have discovered a new art form, creative scrounging. We are sort of advanced junk men taking advantage of advanced obsolescence. And he also insisted that, quote, trapped inside a waste economy, man finds identity as a consumer. But learning, quote, to tear down abandoned buildings, use the unusable, the garbage of America, according to the droppers, produced an alternate identity. This was an identity that was using creative scrounging as a kind of journey of self-discovery. Well, ultimately, the dream of building a new world from the consumer waste of the old could not be reconciled with Fuller's geometric domes. They demanded really precise tolerances. When built from scrap, they leaked from dozens of seams. That bad news was broadcast by an unlikely but impeccable source, Lloyd, the editor of the shelter section of Stuart Brand's Whole Earth catalog, and subsequently with his colleague Bob Easton, was the co-author and editor of Dome Books 1 and 2. You see Dome Book 1 on the left. These were prime resources for hippie builders. And in this image on the lower right, you see and Easton with a baby in his lap his home was featured in a Life magazine, and in 1972 with Dome Book 2, a bestseller, Kahn took a fateful hike in a Marin forest accompanied by a hit of mescaline. Of course, it's the hippie era. So Kahn is out in the wilds. He hallucinates a geodesic dome in a beautiful glade, but as his fantasy vision raced ahead in time, the dome became a hideous canker store of delaminating plywood and yellowed plexiglass. Horrified by his, time trip, Kahn called his publisher and pulled his bestseller from bookstore shelves at the height of sales in order, in his own words, not to have any more domes on my karma. So Dome Book's co-editor, Bob Easton, helped find a new self-build paradigm. Easton was a Berkeley architecture graduate, and he argued that Fuller's dome was not architecture at all, but rather an industrial design invention. And this was something Kahn understood very well, having paid a hefty licensing fee just to publish Fuller's patented diagrams in Dome Book. In Dome Book 2, Kahn had stated, quote, the only growing resource is trash. In contrast, industrial modernism, all the way from the Bauhaus to Buckminster Fuller, demanded technologically advanced first-use building materials. Hippies needed a paradigm for architectural production located further downstream in the flow of resource consumption, and Easton knew exactly where to find it. The 1964 catalog for the New York Museum of Art exhibition, Architecture Without Architects, had made the rounds of architecture schools, including Berkeley's. Easton was deeply impressed by its global kaleidoscope of low-tech vernacular housing. A manifesto conveyed in images rather than text. Architecture Without Architects held special promise for hippie builders attempting to bypass their geodesic dead end. Shelter, Kahn's dome book replacement, championed a funky craft vernacular better suited to, quote, building with junk and scrap, the fallout of industrial society. Kahn depicted the self-build process as one that would also build a new self. Quote, in starting small, simply in heeding local advice, you will change during the building process, is what he told his readers. And reflecting upon his earlier enthusiasm for the geodesic dome, he wrote, our work on domes, although perhaps smart, was by no means wise. So Fuller's geodesics remained a kind of hippie curiosity, but meanwhile, his concept of outlaw areas, which was infused with notions of spatial and cultural liberation, produced a new Bay Area conceptual geography and an architecture to go with it. In 1970, Brand's Whole Earth catalog described the outlaw area as, quote, evolution's open end, a place for other stuff to happen, and potentially an Aquarian haven for the most useful pioneers, in his words, the cream and the dregs of society. And what Brand was writing about was the hippie back to the land movement. So this back to the land movement, which happens starting around 1968 and moves forward into the 70s, is one in which counterculture people looked for cheap, remote pieces of land. It was really a hippie architecture maker culture. And what was built was a do-it-yourself vernacular, mostly constructed from found and recycled materials, often from demolished rural structures. As Kahn wrote in Shelter, wrecking as a way of thinking is a totally different approach to building than working with new materials. So many of these buildings are documented in a wonderful book called Handmade Houses, a guide to the wood butcher's art, which celebrated hippie architecture's junkyard origins. It was put together by Art Boricki, who was a writer, and photographer Barry Shapiro. They scoured Northern California for outlaw builder homes made of salvaged materials. Most of them flagrantly violated building codes and zoning permits. And so in their book, they didn't include the name of a single home location, home builder, or home owner, because they knew that these buildings would attract, even their book would attract to these buildings, building inspectors who wanted to red tag them and tear them down. So fortunately for us, all of these slides were donated to the University of California's Bancroft Library, and all of the slides you see here are recent scans from these beautiful 2¼ by 2¼ inch transparencies. And so what I'd like to do is just roll through a bunch of them and not say much about them because they don't really have any identifying material with them, just to show you some of the really amazing work that was done. Now, below this slide, you'll see Annie and Michael Westlinghouse Canyon, California. That's based on my own sleuthing. So of course, if you take these slides and you compare them to other texts that you can find and things, you can kind of track these down. So here's a fairly amazing house that was built as a kind of inverted, like a boat. And here's the interior of it. An amazing unidentified potter studio. Incredible roof structure and a kind of atrium, and another unidentified home interior built a little bit like a timber teepee. And this house, which is one that I've actually been able to track down and talk to people who lived in it, is one that I think is really merits kind of special attention. This is a house that's kind of one of the stars of Handmade Houses. It's the home of Barry Smith, who was trained as an aeronautical engineer before he dropped out, but he also spent a summer at Paolo Soleri's Arcosanti, where he became very enthusiastic about building. It's tucked in the redwood glen of the town called Canyon, and a legal settlement in the hills east of Oakland, where this was a kind of shrine to the art of outlaw building. If you look at the roof, you'll see it's a very sophisticated warped plane. It's a hyperbolic parabola, and it's a kind of a weird hybrid of a prospector shanty and a modernist pavilion. It reinterprets California's outdoor living for the acid-fueled eco-freaks of an Aquarian age. And in fact, it's a platform for his life. So he's living on an open air platform that exposes his daily activity to anyone who walks by. It's a kind of performance art site. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about this house. It really sort of jumps forward decades in understanding that performance art and architecture can be married in many ways. So Smith's marriage of low and high design yield a kind of first world version of a third world favela. But this has to be the most aesthetically sophisticated shanty ever built from scrap. If you look from the inside up at the ceiling, you'll see how he's constructed this warped plane roof out of peeled eucalyptus posts found on site, plus plywood. And if you look, I don't know if your screen is going to show it, but I'm going to move my arrow. If you look right here, and the lower left of that slide, you will see that Smith has built a pendant lamp that uses exactly the same geometries as his roof. So this is clearly a very sophisticated, knowledgeable kind of building. If we look at Smith's kitchen, on the right, you'll see his kitchen sink. This is a kind of Escher-like maze of kitchen plumbing, it really signifies not a kind of in-law builder's ineptitude, but an outlaw builder's virtuosity. An aesthetic precedent for this kind of post-scarcity primitivism can actually be found locally in beat area assemblage. This was called, quote, the first homegrown California modern art by the critic Peter Plodgens. Like the Smith House, works by San Francisco artist Bruce Conner, whose piece Looking Glass, you see on the left, revel in the capacity to invoke new worlds from the refuse of the old. Conner's name for his creative circle, the Rat Bastard Protective Society, was even inspired by the name of a San Francisco garbage collectors union. And Conner really was a garbage collector. He scavenged materials from San Francisco's Victorians, slated for demolition by redevelopment planners to create art. Conner dubbed his aesthetic funk art, a term he borrowed from jazz. And really both Conner and Smith use funk to stage a confrontation with post-consumer debris. They're basically working with the resonances of trash, the temporal traces of trash, to create a kind of objects that have a temporal depth that is utterly stripped from new construction materials. Now I'd like to just take a look at a photograph that you may have seen already. Here's the unredacted version of Barry Smith and his partner in an outdoor bath at his home. This really gets to the notion of performance art lifestyle. Photojournalist Bruce Davidson's portrait of Barry Smith and his partner disrupts the niceties of middle-class life. A bathtub blown clear of its hygienic quarantine chamber has landed in a timber nest high above a forest in Canyon, California. Privacy and propriety are demolished. Smith's domestic deconstruction proclaims that outlaw areas were built rather than discovered, and that do-it-yourself design innovation could support innovations in human values and relationships. So the fact that outlaw builders used trash as a favored construction material made their work seem like ephemera, things that were meant to be simply disposed of. And for that reason, much of the Bay Area's built counterculture heritage has now disappeared or is disappearing. What has survived remains under threat. So to conclude this talk, I'd like to quickly survey some of the key local sites of counterculture craftsmanship and their current status. Oh, I just wanted to say, I'm getting ahead of myself. This notion of architecture as performance starts to be experimented with by people like Charles Moore, Anna and Lawrence Halpern at a site at Sea Ranch. They conducted something they called experiments in environment, where literally architecture students and professional dancers got together to create a village from scrap and to create the ritual dances and behaviors that would go with this new construction. My point is that Barry Smith was doing the very same thing in a DIY architecture that was really interrogating the whole idea of domesticity. But this is Wheeler's Ranch in the coastal foothills of Sonoma County. This was a key site of the hippie Back to the Land movement. In the early 1970s, about 100 people lived there in outlaw dwellings made from scrap and found elements. What you're looking at here is a home called the Chapel, which incorporates the stumps left by a wildfire as structural supports, the structural supports that modernists call pilotis. So on the right, you can see county officials coming to redline these structures. County officials selectively enforce building codes, literally to harass hippie newcomers. And a small army of public health specialists, building inspectors, county supervisors, even FBI officers would descend on sites like this and red tag the buildings and give a date by which they had to be demolished or accrue massive fines. And so this escalated into something that the architectural historian Felicity Scott calls the Code Wars. And so when bulldozers appeared at Wheeler's Ranch on a pre-dawn raid in May 1973 to plow down illegal structures, the residents themselves set fire to their own dwellings to prevent further damage to the recovering vegetation on the site. And so to make a long story short, this site of handmade houses no longer exists. Located on the site of a former redwood sawmill west of Woodside, the Stark Hill Academy for Anything was founded in 1969, and the endeavors there included crafts from weaving to metal casting, organic agriculture, and sustainability systems. But Star Hill's real claim to fame was building amazing structures were created there, including this one built of recycled materials that have been clearly added, connecting the dots of a circle of redwoods to create a dwelling. On the right, you see Cass Calder Smith as a kid. He grew up here. This is where he learned his building skills that he turned into a very successful commercial architecture career. When he returned to this childhood site recently, he took this photograph of that house. We can see that Star Hill is now lost as a site of these domestic wonders, a victim of abandonment and neglect. Then, incredibly spectacular site. This is Sausalito, and Sausalito's harbor now, which is kind of chic and cute, once contained a very scrappy collection of fantasy dwellings that were built on the site of an abandoned shipyard, abandoned after World War II, and the kind of collapse of the Liberty ship construction area. And what we're looking here is, on the left is the Madonna, built by Chris Roberts around an abandoned pile driving barge. This is presided over this aqueous kind of fantasy world, like a cathedral. And then next to it, a houseboat called the Spanish Helmet. So this bohemian waterfront had a big problem. It was adjacent to one of the wealthiest zip codes in America, and those rich people's houses in the hills looked down on all this junk. And so they really pushed the city to try to, quote unquote, clean the area up. The city had a redevelopment plan for it. And so this yielded trying to get people off the site, what's often called now the houseboat wars. Inhabitants fought back. The developer hired basically thugs to move people off in the dead of night without due process. And so this turned into a decade-long battle of attrition. In the meantime, most of these buildings have disappeared. So there are still a scattering of hippie houseboats, but now they're mostly the very high-class variety. This is another kind of amazing building, photographed by Barry Shapiro, another paraboloid roof, this one married to a log cabin. And this was near the town of Inverness, when a new owner from San Francisco with the means to preserve Waite's mad masterpieces, and on the right you see him building a windmill structure, The new owner purchased the site with plans to add a vacation home. Members of the Inverness Association demanded the demolition of all of these outlaw buildings. So preservation-minded citizens and heritage specialists fortunately prevailed. I was involved in trying to argue the value of these buildings to the Marin County Board of Supervisors. And fortunately for all of us who value the Bay Area's unique cultural legacy, this building was saved and is gradually being restored. So now I'd just like to turn my attention very quickly to kind of give Michael an intro and turning my attention to the site of Druid Heights. Druid Heights is located in a wooded glen facing the Pacific in Marin County. The site remains inhabited by the last of its residents, as you will find out. This residential compound, originally started by Elsa Gidlow and Roger Summers, really became a magnet for Bay Area cultural pioneers, a safe haven where San Francisco beats and their counterculture successors could meet and mingle. Here you see some of the really crucial figures in what's called the San Francisco Renaissance who lived here or came through here or gathered here with each other. People like Alan Watts, whose joyous cosmology kind of mingled experiences with LSD trips and Zen. Gary Snyder, a Pulitzer Prize winning poet, one of the great Bay Area poets. And also a kind of really amazing collection of musicians, rock stars, other people. So Druid Heights is really one of the great sites of the San Francisco Renaissance, cultural Renaissance, one of the great sites of counterculture building that still can be saved, and I would say actually must be saved. So at that, I will hand it over to Michael, and let me stop sharing. Oh, thank you very much.
John, you're on mute.
Thanks,
Greg. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. So I'll be sharing Michael's slides for him, and he will be, if he can, in the meantime, we can have him activate his video.
Michael, your audio is off.
Okay, and may I start? Okay, I can't start my video because you're running my slides, right, John?
Yeah, you should be able to start your video. So I'm going to ask to start your video here.
Okay.
Okay, there we are.
Right. Ah, there we go. Okay.
Oh.
Okay. All right, start my video. Great, you see me now?
Yep.
I hope. And yes, now since you're sharing my slides, I need to get back to my own version here on Keynote. Okay, great. So should be at the first slide here. Yes, so I'm Michael Toivonen, and I'm going to take you, as Greg said, to a really striking historic place. I grew up in Marin County, and I'm now a retired builder. I've done a lot of woodworking and some artwork over the years. And while I grew up in Mill Valley, I never heard of this place. And I grew up there. I'm 61. I grew up there during its heyday. It was really hidden from most people. Knew some people lived there, and that was about it. So as I learned about it in November 2016, and after a visit, I decided over the ensuing months that it really should be preserved, and Greg and I formed the Save Druid Heights group in summer of 2017. In my slideshow, I'm going to first lead you through the site and the significant buildings using recent photos. In the second half of my presentation, I'll take you back in time using vintage photos that I've helped uncover and tell you how that came about. Next slide. Druid Heights is located just a half-hour's drive from San Francisco and in a straight line just a few hundred feet from the parking lot of Muir Woods National Monument. The easy drive to the city, combined with the sense of being much further away, surrounded by spectacular natural beauty, attracted many a well-known musician, artist, writer, actor, and spiritual figure over the years of significant activity, 1954 to 86. And as Greg showed you that earlier picture, that is just the tip of the iceberg. The list of people is long. The original 5-acre site was first developed in the 1920s as a small farm raising chickens. The first owners were a Finnish immigrant couple, Alphonse and Selma Hoppa, who worked day jobs on a large estate in nearby Mill Valley. Alphonse, with the help of friends and family, built the 5 original structures of the future Druid Heights. Later, another acre was added and 17 structures came to cover the site. With 12 of those, along with a large water tank, the cultural landscape have been judged eligible for the National Register of Historic Places by the California State Historic Preservation Office. Note on the map that we're seeing of the structures here, the smaller circle on the far left. That building is known as the library, and our tour will proceed roughly clockwise through the site from there. So Greg mentioned Elsa Gidlow and Roger Summers. These two people had met in a class taught by Alan Watts, a spiritual authority and popularizer, really. It was his probably greatest thing that he did. They met in a class given by Watts at the American Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco, circa 1953. Then they ran into each other again at a picnic in 54, and Summers told her about a property he was looking to find a partner on. Gidlow visited it, loved it, and with really great difficulty as an unmarried woman raised the full down payment. Summers didn't have any money. He had a lot of other abilities, but he didn't have cash in the bank. She chose the most solidly built structure to live in, and Summers remodeled it to make it more to her taste. He and his wife and 2 young children moved into the older original farmhouse, and he was soon engaged in a radical remodel. Now we'd go to the library. The library was built in 1971 and is basically a very large redwood tank with surrounding bands. This is one of 2 buildings at Druid Heights that have round footprints, and a major influence was the work of the later Frank Lloyd Wright. Summers' first commission in 1953 was a round house for a Mill Valley client based on the shell of a chambered nautilus. While the assembly of the tank is said to be one of those who did it to have taken just a couple of days, building as a builder, I can tell you, building millwork and the type of interior details that you see in the library into that circular shape is another matter, and would have taken much longer. Now, the library was originally built for the use of Alan Watts following his move to Druid Heights circa 1970. He had known Gidlow and Summers for over 15 years at this point, and he was living in one of the more famous houseboats down on the Sausalito waterfront, a converted former old ferry boat. And it was very easy for his now legions of admirers to find. So he needed to get out of there. He moved up to Druid Heights and lived his last 3 years there and wrote his final works in this library while living in an adjacent house known as the Mandala. Following his death, a very small kitchen and bath were added to the library, and it had another illustrious occupant. From 1980 to 86, it was rented by lawyer, professor of law, and feminist Catherine McKinnon. McKinnon's work during those years is in part documented in her 1987 book, Feminism Unmodified. During that same period, she wrote the winning brief for the Supreme Court case Meritor Savings Bank versus Vinson, a case decided 9-0 in favor of plaintiff Vinson, and that established sexual harassment in the workplace as a violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now, moving on to Elsa Gidlow's. Elsa Gidlow's house was built in 1943 for their eldest daughter and her family. It was this house that Gidlow soon named Druid Heights, inspired by her friendship with UC Berkeley Celtic Studies lecturer Ella Young and her appreciation for the novel Wuthering Heights. Within a few years, the whole site became known as Druid Heights. Perhaps the most significant alteration by Summers of Gidlow's house was the addition of the bookshelves in the living room, where she did all her writing until the end of her life. It was here that she wrote her autobiography, the first autobiography, an American lesbian, published under the author's name, Elsa, I Come With My Songs. Nearby was the meditation hut built by a sculptor and Druid Heights resident of several years, Detlef Kotzte, to provide Elsa Gidlow with a small retreat and a room for guests. The intricate windows were created by another Druid Heights resident of those days, Kim Hicks. Here we see Hicks' three-dimensional glasswork and Kotzte's sculpted edge shingles. The Twin Peaks house, a modest farmhouse of perhaps 900 square feet, was built by Alphonse Hoppe circa 1920. The gable and peaks of this house were lengthened by Roger Somers in 2 stages, the last time probably in the 1990s. Combined with the saddleback ridge line, they tie the exterior to the tiki texture style of the 1950s and 60s, used mostly in commercial buildings and almost exclusively restaurants. This may be the only residence where it appeared. The Twin Peaks bathroom cabinetry is perhaps the first and the boldest example of Somers' use on many projects of tracery featuring flamboyant curves. It seems most likely, given the other interior details of this house, that he was inspired by the Ranma transom panels of Japan rather than the Art Nouveau movement. The Zendo and Shoji rooms were the gathering place for Roger Somers and others who lived in his portion of Druid Heights. Japanese architecture had a profound influence on modernism, and here Somers went back to the source, and while not strict imitation, he stayed close to the tradition. Somers had hired help on the model of this house, Pulitzer Prize-winning Beat Generation poet Gary Snyder, who was sporadically living in a cabin for a time with writer Jack Kerouac a couple of miles away in the mid to late 1950s. He and Somers had first met circa 1956 at a party given at the floating Sausalito studio of older Cubist artist John Varda. Snyder later came to live in the Twin Peaks following his return from Japan in 1969, staying through spring 70. The circular moon viewing windows are a feature of traditional Japanese architecture. The ceiling, in a very non-traditional construction, is free floating, and for a change of atmosphere, it can be lowered using a pulley mechanism. Inside, there is a piano soundboard built into the wall of the Twin Peaks house, and there are 2 others elsewhere in Druid Heights. The idea in the installation were the work of sculptor Jerry Walter, who rented one of the other buildings as a home and studio from Somers in the late 50s. The painter of the eucalyptus mural is unknown. There are many recessed lights in this house, and they were controlled from this custom dimming switch panel. The Hoppes had built a storage shed and an adjacent garage prior to World War II. Somers soon converted the shed into a workshop. Over the ensuing decades, he continued to add these buildings, and soon they were joined together. The resulting structure eventually became known as Faye's House, after Somers' last partner. It is the site's largest building. While some of the details are intricate, the overall standard of construction was poor, and 17 years of sitting empty have left it likely beyond repair. Building a house around a living tree is often a recipe for eventual trouble, even if the tree is well isolated from the structure. In this case, it wasn't. Somers' workshop eventually included an inverted scissors truss, another detail that creates both an unusual space and a high maintenance zone, a deep center valley instead of the typical ridge. Ed Stiles arrived at Druid Heights in 1965 along with his wife, Marilyn, a potter. His 1979 woodworking shop is a sterling example of the type of workspaces created by many of the best practitioners of the studio furniture movement of the second half of the 20th century. The 1957 shop of Stiles' older friend and nationally recognized woodworker, the late Arthur Espinay Carpenter of nearby Bolinas, is iconically modern, but Stiles' shop design returns to an older tradition, following the form of classic California barns. His use of recycled industrial glazing at each gable end and the peak scissors truss roof framing give the interior the feeling of a church. The interior of his shop, between the natural light, the equipment, and the built-ins, is a craftsman's dream workspace. And I've seen some great ones, and this one truly is. The Stiles Guest House, built in 1974, This building originally contained the detached bedrooms of the style's two sons. A kitchen and bath were later added to make it a standalone small dwelling. The Styles house and ceramic studio was originally a 1930s chicken barn built by the Hoppas. This was the building that Roger Somers rented to his friend, sculptor and set designer for the Anna Halpern Modern Dance Company, Jerry Walter, in the late 1950s. A guest of the Styles sitting at a dining table made from a recycled circular foundry casting pattern. The remodeling of this building, mostly by Ed Styles, has turned it into a structure that exemplifies the hand-built houses that came out of the counterculture era of the 1960s and 70s. While there's debate over who was the first, Ed Styles of Druid Heights is a contender for being the originator of the wooden hot tub with an integrated water heating system. He is said to have built 40 to 50 tubs. Here we see one of them in the Styles house bathroom, but in this case, used as a tub shower. The Mandala House was built for Elsa Gidlow's sister, who had been living on the property in an Airstream trailer. Desiring a warmer climate, she soon left, and the philosopher Allan Watts moved in to spend the last few years of his life at Druid Heights. Somers was a great admirer of the later Frank Lloyd Wright, and that influence is most obvious in the design of the Mandala House. The view up through the center skylight of the Mandala House offers another beautiful example of Roger Somers' use of tracery. I'll add there was also an electric model train that ran around at the juncture between the ceiling and the walls inside the Mandala House. The later crenellated roof of the Mandala House was modeled by Somers on a clown's collar. He is quoted humorously as saying, "Some people live inside square boxes. I live inside a clown's head." Following the death of Watts, an adjustment of parcels at Druid Heights was made and the mandala became part of Somers' property. He continued to remodel it until late in his life. Now I'm going to transition to the second half of my presentation and give you my takeaway regarding documenting a site. Outreach to those with the photos and stories using a Facebook group focused on the site can be a fantastic tool. Each post has the potential to elicit the material you need as you build a community of those who were there back in the day, as well as a group of supporters. The Save Druid Heights Facebook group has, as of August 2020, over 800 members, and they include a number of people with personal connections to the place. The group's enthusiasm for Druid Heights has encouraged the sharing of vintage photos and a flow of anecdotes. Some have even sent us their only hard copies of original photos. And I've brought those with me today. I'm in a different location than my usual because with the threat of fires, I don't want to leave them at home. Since many of these people are up in years, the need to move quickly is real. The woman who sent us the photos above and some of those to follow, Carmen Diaz-Lytle, is sadly no longer with us, an example of the value of moving quickly with social media. While most of the buildings erected by the Hoppas would be very hard or impossible to recognize now, and we see what's the future Twin Peaks house in the background here. Their positioning established the basic layout of the landscape of Druid Heights with its central open area. What was once used to grow feed for the chickens later became the outdoor gathering area for the site. The clerestory windows of the chicken barn from 1965 on, the Styles house, face north, making it a natural art studio as first used by sculptor Jerry Walter. In her autobiography, Elsa Gidlow describes her first visit to Druid Heights in the spring of 1954 and alludes to the still muddy from the winter rains road. Given the unkempt appearance of the place, it had been on the market for 4 years, the large puddle and the vintage of the car, this photo is certainly from around that time, and it may well have been taken on a visit to the property even before purchase by Gidlow and Somers. It and other early photos establish a baseline for the site's built environment and cultural landscape. We have no inkling of the occasion for this photo of Elsa Gidlow, beyond that both she and Somers were interested in Zen Buddhism and Taoism, and the rays of the setting sun on the reading Gidlow suggest spiritual inspiration. We do have indications that Somers wanted a charismatic photo for Japanese-influenced building design work he seems to have been promoting in the late 1950s. This 1963 photo shows artists Gerd Stern and Steve Durkee with Stern's first multimedia sculpture under construction in the foreground in Roger Somers' workshop. The sculpture, Contact is the Only Love, was a revolutionary piece that incorporated lights, movement, and sound. On completion, it went on display at the San Francisco Museum of Art, now the SF MoMA, and from there to museums and galleries elsewhere in the US and Europe. Stern was aided in its several week-long period of construction by Roger Summers, fellow artist Michael Callahan, and perhaps also Durkee. Besides the moment of levity and partially completed sculpture, this photo is full of other significant details. Note the small African sculpture, not a typical workbench fixture, and the pieces of furniture on the right. What was to become called in the 1970s the California roundover furniture style seems to have originated in the late 1950s or early 60s, and these pieces are certainly very early examples. Standing on the bench to the right of Durkee is a crib Summers built for one of Alan Watts' grandchildren. Beyond showing Summers as he perhaps heads back to his workshop following lunch, this photo gives us a great sense of the ambiance of this portion of the outdoor living area at the Twin Peaks house in the late 1960s. Here we see the other side of the Twin Peaks house in 1968. We have yet to learn who made the sculpture on the left, and it is no longer there. In 1971, there was a memorable wedding of a young couple at Druid Heights. The groom, John McVie, was then a member of a local band, Clover, and soon a session player for many of the era's greats. He was to become a member of the Doobie Brothers Band, one of many bands whose members are said to have visited Druid Heights. Here we have a classic photo capturing both the place and the free-spirited times. Note the band platform, which some have said was known as the treeless tree fort. When not in use by adults, it was a play structure for the Styles children and other visiting kids. Roger Summers was a talented amateur sax and conga player, and he frequented the jazz clubs of San Francisco. There he befriended great players associated with modern jazz, such as Dizzy Gillespie and Charles Mingus. They and others would come to Druid Heights to jam. Later, the rockers came, said to include the Quicksilver Messenger Service, Steve Miller, members of Fleetwood Mac, Carlos Santana, Neil Young, and Huey Lewis. Singer Judy Collins and legendary concert promoter Bill Graham are also said to have visited. We have yet to learn the names of these two conga players. Besides the day of the wedding, Summers is said to have had other conga players join him on many occasions to jam. Sex workers' rights advocate Margot St. James became romantically involved with Summers and lived for several years at Druid Heights beginning circa 1970. In this photo, Summers is holding one of the box drums he made many copies of in his workshop. Unfortunately, this small building was demolished by the National Park Service. They are the owners of the site at some point after 2003. One of its former occupants has described it as an early example of a tiny house, and that Summers, ahead of his time, designed it as such. The asymmetric shape is a departure from Summers' more often flowing forms. As alluded to, Roger Summers was a great admirer of the late Wright. In the early 50s, before moving to California, he worked for a time in an unknown capacity on Wright's massive Florida Southern College project. It was there, with characteristic bravado, that Summers managed to corner Wright into a several-hour-long one-on-one conversation in Wright's hotel room while he was in Florida for a site visit. Margot St. James is said to have brought many people of note to Druid Heights. Here we see Margot and radical journalist Paul Krasner, known for his magazine, The Realist. And Greg earlier in one of his photos showed novelist Tom Robbins. It seems Robbins was in part at times inspired by St. James for the creation of some of his characters, or at least one. This was a moon reflecting pool at Gidlow's house. Elsa Gidlow is a passionate gardener, and she embraced the moon and its connection to a mythology of a moon goddess. This small metal pool was in her patio, built for Summers. Roger Summers' son, Tagore, says that his father did a lot of building at Druid Heights without using plans, just improvising as he worked. But many of his paid projects would have needed extensive plans, and it was in this room, once the Hoppa Garage, that he did his drafting. The Mandala House was coined by Alan Watts during his time living at Druid Heights. This and the next photo show it as it was prior to Summers' remodeling and additions following the death of Watts. Originally, it had been called the Casa Rondo by Elsa Gidlow. Here we see the reason for the application of both names, the mostly but not perfectly round shape of the house and the mandala-like pattern on the original roof. This is view from the front, emphasizes the flowing form of the Mandala House's original structure. Perhaps his magnum opus in the mid-1970s, Summers and his crew of carpenters, metal workers, and mechanics converted a large bus into a custom vehicle for rock star Neil Young. The budget is said to have been $400,000, 1975 $400,000. Much of the woodwork was prefabricated in Summers' shop at Druid Heights while the bus resided on the nearby Sausalito waterfront. An unknown woman, Summers, and Neil Young on the bus, circa 1975. Unfortunately, the bus was destroyed some years later by fire following an electrical malfunction. Besides all the photos and stories that have come my way, I've had the great pleasure of paying 2 visits to Druid Heights with people connected to it. One was with poet and multimedia sculptor Gerd Stern. In this photo, Gerd on the right and I walked past the meditation hut on the way to the Twin Peaks house. Gerd had not been back to Druid Heights since a large party held following the completion of his sculpture there in 1963. Gerd is a great storyteller and had some very clear memories of his time at Druid Heights 5 years before our visit. Beyond their architectural and aesthetic value, historic places, in my opinion, offer the best location for telling the story of our nation's multifaceted past. My only regret from my day there with Gerd is not having had a filmmaker with us to capture the full experience. The current situation at Druid Heights, in a very tiny nutshell, as those of you in the preservation field will surely know, is that Druid Heights was judged eligible for the National Register by the California State Historic Preservation Office in 2018 following a submission by the National Park Service. But almost nothing is currently being done to preserve the unoccupied portions of the site. Our group hopes that the National Park Service can be persuaded to allow preservation to occur by first arresting the deterioration of the site's National Register eligible structures. We realize that their resources are stretched, but we feel that with outside help can be found if the National Park Service decides they're open to it. And well, that's my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Michael. I am frankly speechless. I wanted to, before we get into the question and answers, I wanted to let everybody know that we are recording this program and we'd like to go over that 1 hour a little bit so we have more time for discussion. And Greg, you can go ahead and turn on your camera and your audio right now.
It says that the host has stopped sharing. So John, can you?
I'll get you going, Greg.
Well, anyways, we are recording this, and if you signed up, you'll get a link to the full recording later this week. Just to start the discussion, I wanted to invite Peter to come on. You can go ahead and I'm going to ask you to start your video. Peter is with the Cape Cod Modern House Trust. Hi, Peter, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
Thanks for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I wanted Greg and Michael, I asked Peter to join us today because he has experience with saving a collection of houses that were on Park Service property. Peter, would you mind just sort of sharing in a capsule how you managed to succeed? I know you put a lot of years into the effort.
Yeah, so I started the Cape Cod Modern House Trust in 2006. With the purpose of leasing and restoring some modernist houses in Wellfleet on the Outer Cape. So long story short, there's a very parallel situation, although earlier, on the Outer Cape. So the Outer Cape was a art colony for writers and painters, and then a bunch of Bauhaus architects who were teaching at Harvard and their associates came to the Cape when land was very cheap and built a lot of experimental summer cottages that were very ambitious, but also very homemade and sometimes incorporating old hunting shacks and pieces of old buildings and driftwood. So they were very high concept and very low budget. And so the Park Service created the Cape Cod National Seashore, which is almost half the Outer Cape is a national park. And a bunch of these houses ended up owned by the park, and the park intended to demolish them. And around the mid-2000s, it became clear that some of them were historic. And so I started the trust to be able to lease these buildings. So we have leased and restored 4 of them, which we rent in the summer to fund the whole project. We do an artist residency in the fall, and then we do a lot of tours and projects with architecture students and other, basically these were centers of creative activity. So the idea is to keep that process going. There are also in Provincetown at the very end of Cape Cod, there's a whole neighborhood that it looks so much like Druid Heights called Tosheville, which is all of these homemade houses built in the 60s that are, violate every building code, in the world. but some of them could be exactly parallel.
Great, thanks, Peter. Sorry, I got zoomed out for a minute, but I am back. I was just wondering, in particular, that your experience, I missed some of that because I lost the signal.
Okay.
But did you have to go through that process with the Park Service where they were analyzing whether these buildings were they grandfathered in? We got a couple of comments from people saying that there were some Class K code wars, they're calling this, from Nevada County. One was in Mendocino County. Someone said in New Mexico. Was that kind of something that you had to deal with as well?
What is that now?
I'm not sure what Class K code war is.
I can tell you, I'm a resident of Mendocino County part-time, and so that was basically, there was, as Greg described, the demolitions of the many buildings. So similar things were happening in Mendocino County. A struggle ensued, and eventually the county instituted an alternate building code called Class K for people who lived on larger parcels to basically have less strict standards to follow. And it still exists in Mendocino County. If you want to build something closer to one of these places and you want to have some cooperation from a building authority, buy land in Mendocino County.
Well, we have a lot of these houses. The houses that we have are owned by the federal government, and therefore they're exempt from local building codes, which has been, good for the restoration. The thing is that we have to carry insurance. So our insurer is Lloyd's of London, and Lloyd's of London has their own kind of building code, which we need to follow. So, because they're historic buildings and they're exempt from local building codes, we do have some leeway about keeping them, as originally built.
That's great. I'm just thank you, Peter, for joining us. I did post in the chat window the links to the Cape Cod Modern House Trust. So I encourage everybody to go to your website. I wondered if anyone has any questions. John, have you been getting questions in the Q&A box?
Yes, we have. So going back to Druid Heights, there were some questions about, I think you didn't really describe what the access level is currently with Druid Heights and whether there's public access, and people are wondering if they can go visit Druid Heights now.
So the Park Service requests that you not visit Druid Heights. Druid Heights is, well, basically you can't drive there. You can't drive, even though it's close to Muir Woods. The actual walking distance is much farther, probably close to a couple of miles. Muir Woods, just to go to Muir Woods now, you need a pre-registration, parking, all this stuff. But again, Druid Heights is still partially inhabited. When the Park Service bought it, they allowed the 3 parcel owners then, which was Elsa Gidlow and through her, what was called the Society for Comparative Philosophy, they were actual title owners, Summers and the Stiles family, to at the purchase of it by eminent domain to lease back their former homes for either 25 years or their lifespan. Gidlow did 25 years, and so her portion is completely empty. Summers was in 2 parcels. One of his parcels is empty, but even though he passed away, his partner, Faye Summers, still has rights to the Mandala, and it is still inhabited. Ed Stiles still has his house and the attached guest house and his workshop. So those are all no trespassing, private homes. And these are older people. It's really an invasion of their privacy to go down there. So at this point, no, you shouldn't go to Druid Heights. But we're continuing to develop, online sources. And as Christine linked to my Medium story, a walk through Druid Heights, that takes you really through the uninhabited portions of the site.
So maybe I have a question based on some of these questions that are coming through, and I'm going to consolidate some of these. First of all, there was a mention by Adrian. He said there's another model like Cape Cod in the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore of 1933-34 century progress homes, where the NPS entered into a long-term lease to ensure that the historic properties in the park are maintained. So it sort of shows a creative thinking in terms of how to continue the use of these buildings while still being able to cover the maintenance costs, maybe which the NPS may be concerned about. And then the issue about the building codes, there was earlier the mention of the Class K building code. I just thought it's interesting to note that these buildings are all coming up on many of them have already passed the 50-year mark. So they're more likely to be considered historic resources. In fact, they've been considered eligible. So things like the California Historical Building Code and some of these other modifications or allowances to the code can be applied. And I think there's some other issues that both of you may be familiar with in Marin, like the last resort, which you've probably heard of that issue. Some of these other properties that are trying to be protected or recognized as historic resources.
I'd like to throw something in, John. One thing about Druid Heights is that actually two of the most significant buildings, the Mandala and Elsa Gidlow's house. Elsa Gidlow's house, I have full construction series photos. It's built like a tank. It's full perimeter foundation. So, and the Mandala is on a concrete foundation. The Twin Peaks was basically built on a pure foundation, but it's built typical for a farmhouse of its era, and the same for the Stiles house. And then Ed's workshop was built totally permitted. So while there are funkier structures there, it's not quite as bad as it looks from the photographs.
Great, thanks for clarifying.
And the library is permitted too.
Okay. There's another question. Is the Save Druid Heights movement, is your idea to preserve and completely restore Druid Heights, or what are your thoughts on how these spaces can be reused?
Well, I think we're in a position a lot like the project on Cape Cod, where the best use, given all the different factors where you have basically the area is already highly impacted with tourists going to Muir Woods, and going back in time, Elsa Gidlow herself had always wanted it to be an artist's retreat. So I think, many in our group feel the best alternative would be follow through on Gidlow's intention, preserve the buildings that have been deemed eligible for the register, except for those that might be too far gone, but preserve those and use them for an artist retreat with very limited, perhaps occasional visitation by the general public.
Okay, I think Chris has a question too that just came through.
I do. I have a question. Are Faye Summers and Stiles part of Save Druid Heights?
Faye Summers, she lives in Mexico. The people who live there are basically they're friends of hers. And my other visit to Druid Heights was with Roger Summers' son, Tagore, but he did not inherit, as it were, anything. It was, because you couldn't go down a generation. It was only the original buyers and their partners. So we've never even heard from Faye Summers. And, and I've talked to a couple of people who are in touch with her, have been in touch with her, and she's very elderly and just not, she doesn't take an interest in it. So, no.
Michael, I had one point of clarification. Which architect did you say worked with Frank Lloyd Wright at Florida Southern?
So Roger Summers, loved Frank Lloyd Wright. He worked at some capacity on Wright's big project. We have no idea what he did down there. I don't think it was anything very high level.
I can help find out. I can help find out. I worked at the University of Florida for a while.
Yeah, he did something there, but it was, I mean, what, 12, 14 large buildings? It was Wright's biggest project. So they must have had an incredible number of people working there. He also worked for a well-known Marin County and West Coast architect, Charles Warren Callister. He worked in Callister's office and perhaps on one of his projects here in Marin before launching out very early on his own.
So was Roger Summers a registered architect?
No,
or?
he was like I guess like Wright, you know. He worked with some architects, and he was a quick study on his own. He was just he was a designer builder.
Interesting. Well, and Frank Lloyd Wright at Florida Southern used a lot of the local materials. So the buildings actually rose from the land. They used a lot of local sand and student labor, apparently.
Well, he could have even been a student laborer. I mean, he was fresh out of what was it? University of Illinois, I think, with a degree in engineering and a minor in English.
So we have one more question here. It says for Greg, what is left of Barry Smith's work? This is from John. Is asking.
I have to say, I have been in touch with Barry Smith's daughter, who still lives on the site. She told me that the building has been abandoned for a long time, and actually I haven't been up to see it. Now with the pandemic, it's still going to take a long while to get there. But in many ways, I mean, I have to say, maybe I'm a softie, but to see these buildings when they're already in ruin it just seems very sad. And so I'm kind of like a cultural archaeologist, going back and trying to put together the stories of these, former masterpieces. I mean, if that might be like pushing a little bit for the Smith House, but I think it's a remarkable building.
Okay, and there, before we close out today, and I'll give some people some information on how to leave feedback today, but there was a mention of a comment, both a comment and sort of a question about whether or not Druid Heights is being recognized as a district. I'm assuming it is. I think that was discussed.
Yes, I believe in my layman's understanding of the complexities of it, I believe that it is, but I'm not 100% on that. It's certainly, the most interesting thing that happened was there was the submission by the National Park Service was greatly expanded by to include many more buildings, increase the time period. And we would advocate actually that the time span be taken up to the death of Gidlow. So it would include the time when she wrote her autobiography and the time period when McKinnon was living there. Both really productive activities. And I didn't go into it, but there was a lot of productive activity at the site.
Great, and the comment was actually in relation to that is, with a district nomination, you can recognize all these other features like the landscape, the spatial relationship, intangible qualities, and it's probably the perfect route to go with this site. So I'm now going to remind people that the feedback form is now being pasted into the chat box. So if you'd like to leave feedback about today's program, just let us know what you thought, but also more importantly, what you'd like to see in future programs. We're now in full force for planning everything that happens for our next year of programming, which starts on October 1st. So let us know. It's going to
be exciting, right, John? We got some surprises.
We're thinking of doing a full series on what should we call this? Outlaw architecture?
Yes, outlaw architecture. Well, yeah, I think it'd be great. So Greg and Michael, we still have a couple of questions out there, but let me just ask you real quick. Are the Druid Heights NPS documents available?
No, they are incredibly hard to get a hold of. Actually, they have not made them available online, and they at this point are only available in hard copy at the Mill Valley and Sausalito, California public libraries. I have photocopied all the submission documents, but I've yet to try and put those up somewhere, but no, they haven't done that. And so those are just my iPhone photos of the pages. I'd also like to add that if people have further questions, they can email me at savedruidheights@gmail.com. All one word, savedruidheights@gmail.com.
Great.
I'm going to put that into the chat window. And I think we should wrap it up. So for, let me see, it's Save Druid Heights. I'm typing it in. Oh, you got it already? Thanks, John. He's faster than I am. So Greg, how can people get in touch with you or find out more about your work?
Well, let's see. If you look under my web page at the University of California, Berkeley, you will find some links to other things and information on other stuff that I'm working on. It's probably the best right now.
Okay, great. I'm counting on John to look that up and put that in there real quick. And then Michael, we have your email. Is there any place else? You have a Facebook page, right?
Right. So we have our Save Druid Heights Facebook group. There's posts going back to 2017, tons of, innumerable comments, some of which actually are of significance. Many stories, many more photos. The medium.com walk through Druid Heights story. We have a savedruidheights.org webpage. So those are all resources. And by Googling Druid Heights, you'll also find various media stories, mostly from the early 2010s, probably the New York Times and several of our local media outlets did stories back around then.
Oh, wonderful. I can see John is posting a lot of those links inside the chat box. I want to thank you both again for all of your time and expertise. And John, you ready to wrap it up?
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my video. All of you can feel free to do the same.
Where'd you go, John? You got muted.
Oh, I'll leave this room open just for a minute or two more, and then they can use those links in the chat box before I close the room.
Okay, well, thank you, Greg and Michael. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.